Church, UCC, here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Can I turn my mic on? Well, we are an open and affirming church, yes it is on, meaning whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome and loved at First Reformed Church. My name is Pastor Devin Jeffers, I'm the lead pastor here, and along with Pine Street Presbyterian in Harrisburg. Hi, Pine Street. Hey. We are hosting Adult Forum Series with Reverend Dr. Vanessa Lovelace. And Dr. Lovelace is delivering a series of lectures on the theme, Who's Your Mama? Why Does It Matter in the Old Testament and in Today in Politics of Belonging, based on her book entitled A Womanist Reading of Hebrew Bible Narratives as the Politics of Belonging from an Outsider Within. And you can purchase her book visiting Lexington Fortress Academics, where you can get a special 30% discount, and it's also available wherever books are sold. You can get it on Kindle as well. I got mine on Kindle, so you can get it on Kindle as well. Again, so glad to come and share with you tonight. Glad to have Pine Street also co-hosting with us tonight. And so without further ado, I will turn it over into the hands of Dr. Lovelace.
Good evening, everyone. This week, we will delve into the fascinating story of Noah's curse in Genesis 9. So I hope that those of you who may have looked at the book, the table of contents, or at least skimmed it, the introduction, which is actually available on the Amazon, has the introductory chapter. There we go. Starting again. Good evening, everyone. This week we will delve into the fascinating story of Noah's curse in Genesis 9. And I hope that you read it in advance, Genesis 9, verses 18 through 27, actually 19 through 27. If you read the introduction to my book, that is available on Amazon.com as a sample chapter. I give a little overview there of what I intended to cover in this chapter. But this chapter, Outsider Within, a Vineyard, a Curse, and U.S. Racial Politics, is, as I look at Genesis 9, I looked at how it serves as a microcosm of larger racial dynamics in the United States. In this chapter, I trace the history of the interpretation of Genesis 9, from rabbinic, Islamic, and Christian texts to the development of the doctrine of Black inferiority in the antebellum period, and conclude at contemporary social issues of race, gender, and sexuality. This story isn't just about a biblical curse. It's about interpretation, anti-Blackness, citizenship, and the politics of belonging from an outsider within. The story of Noah and his family, as recounted in Genesis chapter 6, starting at verse 11 through chapter 9, 17, is familiar to many readers. Fascination with the biblical story of how God became disillusioned with the wickedness and corruption of human beings and sent an epic flood to destroy them, save a righteous man named Noah, his family, and selected pairs of animals housed in an ark built by Noah, has fueled the imaginations of readers for centuries. The biblical flood story is so deep-rooted in Western pop culture that the lyrics to Schoolhouse Rock's Elementary, My Dear took for granted that elementary-aged children would know the story of Noah and the flood. 40 days and 40 nights, didn't it rain, children? Not a speck of land in sight, didn't it rain? But Noah built the ark so tight, they sailed on, children. And when at last the waters receded and the dove brought back the olive tree leaf, he landed that ship near Mount Ararat. And one of his children grabbed Noah's robe and said, "Hey, Dad, how many animals on this old ark anyway?" At which point the father launches into a song about the multiplication table. So for those of you who are not of my generation and don't know Schoolhouse Rock, look it up on Google. When the waters had subsided and God sent Noah and his wife, sons, daughters-in-law, and every living creature out of the ark, the narrator reports that Noah built an altar, offered burnt offerings, and when God smelled the pleasing odor, notice how God is described in anthropomorphic terms in this reading, that imagine God with nostrils who smelled the aroma of this burnt offering going up. God promised that God would never again curse the ground because of humans. In chapter 9, God blessed Noah and his sons and commanded them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. In verses 8 through 17, God established a covenant with Noah and his descendants and every living creature, committing to never allow another flood to destroy the earth. As a sign of the covenant, God placed the rainbow in the clouds as a reminder to God's self and every living creature. Beginning at verse 18, the narrator introduces us to a new episode in the Noah saga that many readers are less familiar with, that is focused solely on the post-flood lives of Noah, his sons, and grandson. The sons of Noah who went out of the ark were, according to verse 18, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. The editorial addition that Ham was the father of Canaan is jarring and alerts the reader to pay attention. There is a reason why we should know that Ham was the father of who? Where did this new character come from? This wasn't someone who was on the ark. What follows is a perplexing incident between Noah and Ham that resulted over the centuries in interpretations about sexual innuendo about Noah, Ham, Canaan, a curse of blackness and slavery, and white superiority. Beginning in Genesis 9, verse 20, Noah is portrayed as a man of the ground, having planted a vineyard. The association of Noah with the earth links him with the first human, who is formed from the dust of the ground, and his son Cain, who was a worker of the ground, like his father before him. However, Noah's earthiness is not the only characteristic that he shares with his two predecessors. Each one of them is also characterized by a planting that leads to a dubious future. The narrator wastes no words getting to Noah's indiscretion in verse 21. He drank, he was drunk, he lay uncovered. Noah, who imbibed too freely of the fruit of the vine, is left lying drunk and uncovered in his tent. Noah's nakedness and drunkenness, in and of themselves, are of no moral consequence to the ancient reader. The problem is that Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father in verse 22. On one level, Ham seeing his father's nakedness should be understood as having literally seen Noah's genitalia. What we refer to as the Holiness Code, Leviticus chapter 17 through 26, includes a list of sexual offenses to avoid, including uncovering the father's nakedness, which is also the mother's nakedness. Quote, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. On its face, it is understood that it is taboo for a son to engage in sexual relations with his mother, leading some scholars to suggest that Ham engaged in an incestuous relationship with his mother. However, Ham did not uncover his father's nakedness, but rather the Hebrew verb used indicated that Noah uncovered or exposed himself. While the debate continues regarding whether Ham committed a sexual offense in seeing his father's nakedness, the seeing is not really the issue. It is the telling. Ham reacts to the spectacle by reporting to his brothers outside what he had observed inside. What specifically Ham recounted to his brothers is left unsaid. As one scholar pointed out, there is no modifier to support the verb to tell, as in he told what he saw, or he told what he did. By telling his brothers whatever he told them, brought shame to his father. Noah, who has been regarded by some as a paragon of righteousness, is somehow dishonored by Ham. Once the wine's effects wear off and Noah awakes from his drunken stupor, the narrator reports that Noah knew what his youngest son had done to him. And that was verse 24. As mentioned above, the debate over just what is it that Noah knew was done to him is left open to readers' imagination. Complicating the text ambiguity is what Noah does in response. In the history of interpretation, his actions will reverberate for centuries with implications for the intersection of religion, anti-Blackness, and Black sexuality in the development of the American racial hierarchy. Noah retaliates by cursing Canaan, Ham's son. So you remember going back to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Ham was the father of Canaan, and so that links us back to why Canaan was introduced in the story in the first place. Noah's curse consigned Canaan, whose descendants become Israel's enemies, to be a slave to his brothers. Now, again, there's that textual problem. Who's the brother and who's the grandson? Who's the son? This has been one of those puzzles that scholars have dealt with for centuries. But the question, when Blackness becomes associated with slavery and whether the Bible is responsible, has been hotly debated since the late 20th century. Three factors that contribute to why the Bible came to be identified with the origin for associating Blackness with slavery are geography, etymology, and proximity. The putative ancestors of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan, and their geographical designations in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 helped to fuel ideas that Ham was Black. Cush, or Meroe, has long been regarded as located in Africa south of Egypt. Put is believed to be in northeast Africa in modern-day Libya, and Canaan is northeast of Egypt. Canaan, Palestine is that area. Taken together, Ham's lineage would cover parts of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Levant. The expansion of Arab traders into East Africa, which turned into wars and conquests, expanded the growing numbers of non-Blacks having contact with Africans, and so there's the proximity. Although I go into depth about rabbinic, Islamic, and early Christian texts that attempt to explain why Canaan and not Ham was cursed by linking slavery and Blackness, I am not going to detail them this evening. Instead, I want to focus on scientific, religious, and legal efforts to build up this anti-Blackness and Black inferiority and white superiority. When the theory of the curse of Ham became deeply rooted in American pro-slavery rhetoric is debated, But John Patrick Daly and other scholars contend that by the antebellum period, the dissemination of publications using racist arguments in defense of slavery, fueled by anti-abolitionism, were pervasive. He writes, quote, "Racist religious ideologies based on scripture, such as the so-called curse of Ham in Genesis 9, were used to justify enslavement of Africans before slavery was instituted in America. No society in history, however, produced nearly the volume of religious pro-slavery writings that appeared in the antebellum South," end quote. Many Bible readers who read the text literally follow the belief in monogenesis, or the theory that all humanity descended from a common ancestor, Adam, who many assume was white. Many literalist readers of the Bible adhere to, but if Noah and his sons were white, then how did Ham become black? A popular antebellum era theory promoted by pro-slavery advocates was polygenesis, or pre-Adamism. Polygenesis is the scientific theory, or the pseudoscientific theory, that the different races did not have a common ancestor, but rather that each race had a separate and distinct ancestor, contrary to the account in Genesis of a single human ancestor. Pro-slavery advocates adopted the racial theories of polygenesis to argue that the lowly condition of blacks as slaves was supported by science. Richard Colfax published the pamphlet Evidence Against the Views of the Abolitionists in 1833 in defense of the view that blacks could never belong as members of the nation because blacks were by nature culturally and intellectually inferior to whites. Yet Josiah Priest tracked slavery as it relates, this is a popular clergyman, a prominent clergyman. Josiah Priest tracked slavery, as it relates to the Negro, or African race, perhaps did more to advance pro-slavery apologetics in the antebellum period, using the curse of Ham than any other effort. Priest offers a fanciful tale of the origin of the African's black skin complexion and racial slavery. According to Priest, first Adam and then Noah, his wife, and son Shem had red skin complexions. But God turned Japheth's skin white and Ham's skin black in their mother's womb. He claimed, as others before him, that the name Ham was Egyptian for black. Priest wrote that Ham's transgression in Genesis 9 was in keeping with the whole character, nature, and constitution of Ham and the black race, which he described as sensual, devilish, lewd, promiscuous, and indifferent to the, quote, regulations of virtuous principles, end quote. Priests linked the sexualization of Ham's transgression by others to racial slavery and inferiority of the black race. So I've talked about the pseudoscientific and the theological, and finally, as part of my conclusion, and this is at the end of the chapter, yet Josiah Priest, but it was the judicial system, deeply imbued with the doctrine of black inferiority, that emboldened pro-slavery apologists and segregationists, as the opinion of Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Tunney in Scott versus Sanford, as that demonstrated. Tunney's opinion was that blacks descended from enslaved Africans. And you remember, this is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the 19th century. His opinion was that blacks descended from enslaved Africans were not American citizens withstanding to sue in federal court. Tunney was predisposed to deny black citizenship based on his belief that blacks were of a human order inferior to whites, beliefs that he appeared to share with fellow segregationists in the superiority of whites to blacks and other non-whites based in biblical teachings. Thus, the two documents most valuable to blacks, the Bible and the Constitution, were used to deny them citizenship based on race. Yet, in the words of Frederick Douglass in his address to the 1853 Colored National Convention in Rochester, New York, advocating for black citizenship, quote, "By birth, we are American citizens. By the principles of the Declaration of Independence, we are American citizens," end quote. As such, for blacks, Tunney's question whether the Negro, whose ancestors were kidnapped and bought and sold as chattel, could become full U.S. citizens under the Constitution with all rights pursuant, the answer was a resounding yes, because the Bible and the Constitution told them so. Thank you.
If you're joining us tonight, thank you so much for joining us. We are in a discussion in chapter 2, where it is entitled Outsider Within, a Vineyard Curse in U.S. Racial Politics by Vanessa Lovelace. Dr. Lovelace, could you share a little bit of how your personal background and experiences as a womanist shaped your approach to this matter?
Yes, thank you. So I think I said last week, that my womanist, both in terms of my scholarship and my politics, is influenced by black culture, especially Southern black culture, and the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, and class, and how those aren't separate identities, but that they intersect, and that when black women are impacted simultaneously by those various forms of discrimination. And so as I read biblical texts, and I bring my whole self to reading those texts, I don't leave my history, social, political self behind. Some scholars have contend that there is a totally unbiased scientific way, and if you have the right tools, that you will come to this universal interpretation, or the same interpretation, and that's not true. It's a more scholars are saying, no, we all have history, we all are not these empty vessels, we all come with our own, they use the term, the German term, sensibility, the seat in life that influences how we live, our upbringing, media, other social influences impact how we interpret the Bible. And so I interpret it from my perspective as both a Bible scholar, trained Bible scholar, but who brings that African American Southern oneness, the sensibility to reading text.
So who would you say on the outside?
The outside within, as I mentioned, and as in the title of the book as well as this chapter, and this chapter really was the first chapter, even though it ended up being the second chapter, but I wrote it first, and as far as what I can mention, this is the only original of the chapter 2 and 5 were the two original, whereas the other chapter that I talked about last week was another journal article that I had reworked, revised, and expanded, and chapters 3 and 4 were chapters of my dissertation that I revised and expanded. And so this was actually the first, and why my book title was originally Outsiders Within, a womanist reading of the Hebrew Bible politics as a narrative as the politics of belonging, and the publisher asked me to switch to put it at the end. But the notion of, when I talk about blacks and citizenship, that we are outsiders within, that even though we are citizens and we were born here, we're still treated as outsiders. And so even though we live here, we pay taxes, we vote, but we're still treated as outsiders. And likewise, when I read sort of the little text, when I talked about Ishmael, who was born into Abraham's family, he was the firstborn. He should have been the one, the rightful heir to the benefits, and so he was an insider, but he gets made an outsider in the end. And similarly, the Canaanites, the grandson of Canaan, clearly, I mean, textually, is related to Noah, is part of the family. He's Ham's son, so he's an insider, but he gets made an outsider through this curse and through the later, which some scholars will say, well, this story is about how the Israelites and the Canaanites became enemies. Otherwise, how do you have, and that it was really, the three sons were really Shem, Japheth, and Canaan. And Ham was a later addition somehow. There were like these two narratives that got merged together. It really, when I asked the question about, well, why is it Canaan's brothers and not Ham's brothers? And so that's one of the ways that scholars have tried to resolve that problem is, was it really the three sons, Japheth, Shem, and Canaan? And then somehow Ham, in the table of nations in Genesis 10, is like, well, where does this Ham come from? Well, we've got to put Ham back in here somewhere. So we'll make him one of the brothers and make Canaan his son. But so again, you have Canaan, Noah's grandson or Noah's son, however that is, who's an insider but gets made an outsider. You have Ishmael, born to Abraham, who's an insider but gets made an outsider. And so that's the idea of, or biblical scholars of color who are in the academy but are made or treated like outsiders. So that's where that comes from.
I mean, that's a testimony to Black America outsiders within. So you say there's a part in this book you talk about right along with the same. You said a consequence is that the Canaanites who were originally insiders become outsiders by the group that has been elevated due to the curse. Could you share a little bit about the group?
It's Shem and Japheth that, again, familial, that it is Shem, Japheth, Ham, and Canaan, but by virtue of Canaan being ostracized and Ham along with him as his father, and later on in the interpretations, again in the Table of Nations, remember that it's Canaan who is cursed, but over the centuries it's been called the curse of Ham. And it's because that Ham gets associated with blackness, and in that move to justify legally the enslavement of blacks based on race, that Ham's curse, or Noah's so-called curse of Ham, is convenient for saying this is why, that this is divinely ordained that blacks are inferior and should be enslaved because the descendants of Ham were enslaved through Canaan. But it's Canaan who is cursed, not Ham, and it is Noah who does the cursing, not God. And so it is not God ordained, even though people have interpreted it that way. So on one hand, it's not a metaphor. It is literally what happens in the text. But then it becomes a metaphor down the line in terms of the interpretation for the segregation, enslavement and segregation of blacks over the centuries. Exactly.
Discussion tonight, we are in chapter 2, Outsider Within a Vineyard. The rest of it here. A curse, a vineyard, a curse, and it was wrong. We were talking about the metaphors that are related to the curse. Would you mind speaking of the metaphor of the vineyard?
So the vineyard, it's how I'm trying to struggle with that. The vineyard is, in some ways, it's a metaphor for what gets Noah into trouble. And so you can translate that metaphorically as well, I'll just say, I don't see it metaphorically, but I think some have interpreted it metaphorically for just problems, sin, transgressions, and so that's one way that it's translated metaphorically. But it's, and when you link it back to Genesis 3, when you link it back to Adam and Noah and Cain and how all of these plantings, planting tree, planting produce, and how they use them gets them into trouble. And so that's why I think metaphorically the vineyard can represent sin or weakness, but in the story here it's also literally a vineyard.
The challenges presented by systemic racism, how would you, how would you illustrate how, what should the reader take away from, like, what is it that we need to do as far as resilience, as far as being agents, like, what is the takeaway from that?
I think, well, education. I think we, especially right now with the movement to remove certain texts from libraries and that certain subjects shouldn't be taught in schools, even college courses, if they mention race, you know, that whole critical race theory a couple of years ago. You notice that that's kind of died down, but in regards to, I mean, critical race theory was not being taught. Critical race theory is a legal theory that is usually taught in law school. It is not taught to elementary school children. But the idea that it has race in it, it was, okay, so we can't talk about race because white children will be made to feel badly about themselves. I certainly think that, so what happens when you don't talk about certain things? One, when they do find out the truth, then they're angry at, why was this kept from me? But also, there's a sense of so-called innocence, that you're protecting a certain innocence. And what is this innocence that you're trying to protect them from? Is it whiteness and the goodness of whiteness? And so education and being honest and reading those texts that talk about race and systemic racism and white superiority, white Christian nationalism is a big topic right now, but all of those are tied together. And so having those conversations in churches, having those conversations in our groups, whether it's a social club or a book club, the library, public libraries, I think that is one of the important places and where we start.
I don't know where the concept of idea came from, but you always looked at white as good or perfect or pretty or whatever, and then black was bad or dark, or it didn't represent anything positive. And so, yeah, you would say I'm brown or I'm light. You would try to make up things to try to compensate for it, but who put that concept in us that black was bad? Who put it in that it was a negative thing and not a positive thing?
Gay Byron, who co-edited the Womanist Interpretations of the Bible, Expanding Discourse, which is a volume of womanist essays. Her first book was actually on symbolic blackness, and from the New Testament and early Christianity were some of those terms, or some of those religious associations with blackness, with evil, with dirty, with bad. And so then we, as African Americans, later in the 19th century, early 20th century, that became ingrained in certain ways that blackness was bad, and so we would sing songs about turning our heart or our soul from black to white as snow. And LaShawn Pace, I don't know if you know, yeah, she has a gospel song, and I Know I've Been Changed. And when she's going into the more narrative part of the testimonial part of that song, that gospel song, and here we are in the 21st century, it might have been the 20th century by then, but definitely in the 21st century, says that he, turned my black soul to white. So it's like all of these centuries later, we're still associating blackness with bad and evil, and which was why it was so important in the 60s when James Brown came out with Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud.
I wanted to know, when you dealt with the intersectionality, you talked about how it dealt with race, it dealt with gender and class. Could you share again briefly how those intersections create different challenges that I'd say minorities or marginalized would go through?
Yeah, in terms of, again, it's different. Theoretically, I would say, the term intersectionality originally described black women were doubly simultaneously discriminated against because, and again, when I talk about Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term, and she was a legal scholar, she is a law professor, but she wrote about a case of, I think it was GM, but one of the automakers, where there were two lawsuits, well, really three lawsuits, but when there was furloughs or layoffs, they kept the jobs for the white men, and so the black men who worked there sued on the basis of racial discrimination. And the white women sued on the basis of gender discrimination, because they were all laid off. The black women said, but I am being discriminated against as both a black and a woman simultaneously. And so, she didn't fit into either of those separate categories because it was the black men who were arguing on the basis of race, and there was the white women who were arguing on the basis of gender. And when black women said, yeah, but we're the bottom and the last hired, the last first fired, and and so we're doubly discriminated against, and the judge says, well, no, that's two bites at the same apple, so I threw out their case and acknowledged the black men and the white women, but threw out the black women's. And that was when she coined the term intersectionality, to try and get you to understand that if you are in an intersection and you get hit by a car, and that's the race car, and then as you are, pivoting from the being hit, and then you get hit again from another direction by the gender car, then the ambulance is not gonna say, well, do we take her in for the gender or the race? It's like, we've gotta treat the whole patient, so.
As we wrap it up a little bit, I wanted to know, could you share a little bit on, we touched about a little bit last week on the belonging part, and I guess the politics of inclusion and exclusion.
Yeah, the politics, so belonging, as I described, is a feeling that you have of being welcomed, at feeling at home, being included, and the politics of belonging is who makes the decision, who gets to belong, who gets to be invited in, who gets to be an insider, and what are the policies, the processes that they use to determine who's an insider and who's an outsider. And so the politics of belonging are our current immigration, or an example of that would be our current immigration laws, that are neither consistent over the centuries. They've been very fluid. Certain people will talk about coming in legally. My parents, did it the right way, but the laws were different when their parents came in, and in some regards, there weren't even certain immigration laws didn't apply to certain groups, or certain groups were allowed in without any other papers or justification, versus later as they started expanding who could be included. And so it's those decisions over who gets admitted in and on what basis. That's the politics of belonging.
So next week, your chapter is Mammies, Jezebels, Prophetess, and Royal Women. Can you give like a little snippet of what you're going to share next week?
That is that was from my dissertation on Deborah and Huldah. Those were two women prophets, and their counterparts in the book of, in what we call the historical books, the academic term, Deuteronomistic history, or in the Tanakh, the former prophets, are the only two women in the period from the entry into the promised land and when they are exiled from the promised land. And so one's at the beginning, one's at the end. And so I argue that symbolically they represent the covenantal relationship between God as if their loyalty allowed them to enter, and that represents Deborah, but their disloyalty, which causes them to be removed in the first place, is Huldah. But in between, their counterparts are two royal women, who Jezebel and Atalia, who are they're considered evil and dismissed, and associated with Jezebel is associated with whoredom and all the bad things. And so you have these two women who are symbolic of Israel, and you have these two women who are the total antithesis of these two women. So I look at those four women alongside each other and how they are treated symbolically to represent Israel.
We want you to join us if you have not picked up Dr. Lovelace's book, A Womanist.
Is anyone on the, there are like 7 people. No questions, just wanted to make
Any
sure.
questions in the comments? If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments and we'll try to address those. If you have any questions or comments, if you put them in the comments, we can address those.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I think one of the things that we figured out last week is if you don't have a YouTube account, you have to create one in order to leave a comment or to join the discussion or to like or react to the conversation.
I didn't see any.
Okay, so they are communicating with you. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So again, pick up her book, A Womanist Reading of Hebrew Bible Narratives as the Politics of Belonging from an Outsider Within. Join us on next week at 7 p.m. We'll be going into chapter 3. I want to say thank you for joining us, and a special shout out to FRC and to Pine Street Presbyterian. Thank you so much, and of course, thank you to Dr. Lovelace for such a rich discussion. We'll see you next week. Join us, tell a neighbor, tell a friend, like us and share us. God bless you. Good night.